Welcome back to Sharing Beliefs. We have the opportunity today to speak to Padre Barbara Helms about the Islamic faith. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the faith you're going to be talking about today?
Hello, my name is Padre Barbara Helms. I'm coming from the Islamic faith. Right now I'm a chaplain with the Primary Reserve, 30th Field Artillery in Ottawa, and I'm also a full-time civilian officiant with the Canadian Forces Support Group of Ottawa and Gatineau.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. So why don't you tell us some of the principal beliefs of the Islamic faith?
So we often summarize the Islamic faith according to 5 pillars, which are both beliefs and practices, as well as central beliefs. And there's also a whole repertoire of etiquette and values and behavioral expectations and also spiritual practices that become part of this way of life. And one of the interesting things is that in the Islamic vocabulary, we don't really have a word for religion. It's called way of life or deen. So the 5 pillars would be shahada, or the witness that there is only one God and that Muhammad is his prophet and messenger. And also that witnesses everything within those belief systems, the way of life that we see in our prophet. We have salat, which is our daily prayers, our ritual prayers that we do at certain times during the day, kind of following the rising and the setting of the sun as a way to connect ourselves to God and to remind us of our, just to get nourishment, but also to remind us of our social obligations and our obligations to live as a good person. But salat actually has the same meaning as reconnecting, like reconnecting a rope that might tie you to someone, or a rope bridge that gets you across, let's say, a ravine. It's something that you maintain every day so that you can use it for that connection. So we also have something called zakat, which is a mandatory contribution of a certain amount of wealth and excess wealth to again, it's a right that those who are less advantageous have on you. It's not a charity. It's an obligation to invest in society so that we don't have a stratification of wealth. We have fasting during the month of Ramadan, and we also go on pilgrimage, if we can, at least once in our life, to Mecca. So those are the 5 pillars. We also have central beliefs in God, in angels, in revealed scriptures, in prophets as messengers. We also believe that everything happens within the power and sustenance of God. That's not to say that God is the author of evil, but that nothing can happen that is outside of the purview of God's sustaining power. And we do believe in life after death. So those are the basic pillars and principles. There are some other important concepts. One is ihsan, which is goodness or virtue, and that can be summarized what we will teach to children is worship God as if you see him, if you see God, because God sees you. So there's nothing that happens, that's independent from God. We also have teachings that God is closer to you than your own jugular vein. And we have this concept of tawheed, our oneness. And so again, I think as a Muslim chaplain, I will often use this because God is not, here's religion and there's life. Here's life with God everywhere. And so I don't necessarily have to speak in an Islamic vocabulary using Arabic words. I can see God's signs in the universe. I can participate in a responsibility to promote healing among any place, anywhere where I find that, and which again, this is the equipment that I would use to be a chaplain that cares for all.
What an insightful way to think about life and to think about traditions. I truly enjoyed your answer. Thank you. Can you tell me a little bit more about people or deities that are important to the Islamic faith?
Well, I think we can start out with the word Allah. And so in Arabic, this is a combination of the definite particle the, and the other part is actually wallaha. It's a word that means God, but actually it's a feminine gender, and it means the ultimate source of compassion and care. And Allah, or the God, is the ultimate source of, so Allah is the ultimate source, and wallaha is compassionate love, the way that a mother would love her children. And so the ultimate source of unlimited compassion. And so that is what Allah means in itself. The other interesting thing is that within the Arab world, Arabic-speaking Christians will use the same word in their scriptures. So that is the ultimate concept of the deity. And there's also beautiful 99 names that will expand on this, like Rahman and Rahim, which again has to do with unconditional care, nurturing, mercy. There's Guide, there's Rabb, which is Lord. And Lord, as someone who converted to Islam with the English as my first language, when I would hear Lord, I think Lord of the mansion, sovereign Lord. But Rabb in Arabic actually has the connotation of a gardener that drips nourishment onto the plants, that helps it to grow vertically. So again, this will lead into the theology that it's not just God who you must, fear and obey, but this is the nurturing source of guidance and care. You can't make something grow by demanding or ordering it. You have to nurture it, maybe guide it, maybe prune it. So the language is very rich in the concept of deity. We do look at Prophet Muhammad as being the particular articulation of faith. He was born in Arabia 570, 571 in the Common Era. And so that would be where we look at the fundamental manifestation or example. And of course, the Quranic revelation or scripture came through that prophet. But Islam understands itself also to be a continuation of God's guidance, most specifically following the prophets that we see in the Hebrew Bible. We revere Jesus and Mary, peace be on them all. We also talk about so many prophets as messengers and guides and reminders of that central message, that no community is left without a prophet. So we will look at different, there may be theological differences in other distinct religious groups, but we may see that hint and that echo of the same guidance as God is trying to communicate with humankind. So those would be our central concepts and I think central figures in terms of the religious faith.
What are some common misconceptions associated with the Islamic faith?
There's many, many, many. And sometimes there's this misconceptions even within the faith group, but as far as the outside world looking at it, of course, the idea is that it's intolerant and violent. And so, again, that sometimes gets into geopolitical conversations and sometimes seeing the Islamic world in opposition to everything else. And so, of course, that really glosses over some very important periods of history of tolerance, of exchange, of the outflowering of really profound civilizations that were multi-faith, multicultural. And then sometimes, so the idea that it's inherently violent, inherently intolerant, what happens is sometimes that's in an unfortunate dialogue of mutual condemnation as opposed to one of tolerance and learning and growth. And then unfortunately, like, both sides tend to bite into it. And so then the more Islam is defined as other, the less it feels part of, and then maybe that gets into that mutually hardening positions where you'll find intolerance and violence at the extreme ends of that, but then it's an interactive, unfortunately, it's an interactive cycle that we're trying to address on both sides. The other is that it's simply about submission, and this is something I actually deal with in my own community, because sometimes people say, oh, Islam means to surrender or submit. And yes, any spiritual faith does require a deferring of the ego to something that's greater than itself. But the actual root meaning of the word Islam means the continual seeking of healing and wholeness. It may involve surrendering your ego, surrendering your obsessions, even with your own shortcomings. But it's not simply surrender, again, to that Lord of the mansion, that scary and all demanding, never satisfied God's sitting on a throne someplace up there with a very hierarchical thing. It means continuous seeking of healing and wholeness. So these are the misconceptions that we try both in terms of our education of Muslim youth and in terms of our engagement in society to live out quite a different message.
Thank you. Can you give me some examples of how this faith is celebrated? Are there special days to be respected?
There are, and the interesting thing is, again, there's a whole theology around celebration, and Muslims do like to have a good time. Family is very important, in engaging in things where you share hospitality with gratitude, but we don't have days that are just celebrated for the sake of celebrating. Usually we have to work first. So our two big celebrations would be the Eid after Ramadan, or Eid al-Fitr, and Eid after the pilgrimage, Eid al-Adha. And so if you work very hard and you fast during the month of Ramadan, you abstain from food and drink before sunrise to sunset, and you do all this spiritual exertion. At the end of that, we get together, wear our fancy clothes, share meals, visit each other in non-pandemic times, and so that would be the first Eid. The second Eid, after those who observe the pilgrimage, right? And also those of us who are not going on pilgrimage that year will have a day of fasting. And then we'll get together again, and we pray first. We have to pray, and then we join together in a group community prayer or salat, and then we have all the hospitality, the wonderful food, the Turkish tea, and coffee and everything. So those are the main days. There are other days that different groups may celebrate or may observe. But sometimes that will be specific to different particular affiliations. And the other days, when we say celebrate, we observe certain fasting days, again, but that's not celebrating in the sense of, let's say some kind of party. It's observances that we would do, and there'll be different things that we may associate with it, different types of food that particular ethnic groups will have. But the two Eids are something in common to all of the different Muslim groups globally.
It sounds like fasting is an integral part of the faith. And I'm assuming also on the other end of the spectrum, food is also quite important. Can you give us some examples of some food or meals that are associated with the Islamic faith?
So, I think that is, again, Islam is a way of life. It's a framework. So when it spread throughout the world, it would take on the colors of the society. So if I talk about specific food, I used to, when I was in Montreal, there was a number of Indonesian students that were studying at the same university, and they had all kinds of, very interesting fruits, and they had a very interesting way of making these cookies that looked like pineapples, and they would have a lot of tropical foods and fruits that they would, especially bring to Montreal for, they start cooking. We have a joke, like, you have to be careful that you observe the fast and you're not just preparing for the Eid afterwards. So that would be something that they would associate with them. There's baklava, there's kebab, there's all kinds of regional foods that are rich and delicious. In terms of the religion itself, as opposed to the cultural framework in which people are living out that faith, I think the thing that comes to mind is dates. Like, we hear about dates. There is a chapter that's devoted to Mary, Mother of Jesus, peace be on them both, during the birthing process. And in the Muslim scripture, she needs sustenance, and so she's told to shake a date tree, and it provides dates for her. And so, for example, in labor, dates have a certain enzyme that's very helpful for contracting the uterus. And so we see dates there. We see dates in the life of the Prophet for breaking fast. And so that seems to be something that will be, no matter where you are in the world, it's very common to see for the breaking of the fast, you have a glass of water or maybe tea and a date. So I think the date is the most basic thing that I would associate with Muslims and the practice of the Muslim faith. But other than that, it's celebrating with gratitude whatever food is in that particular cultural region or population.
Mm-hmm. That's really important to keep in mind, I think, when we're talking about different faiths and different geographical regions. Can you give us an example of an important tradition that's associated with the Islamic faith?
So again, I think there are sort of sacred history. So when you talk about the Hajj, there is the understanding, and we even find it in the Hebrew Bible when Abraham takes Hagar out to the desert. That was like Mecca in those words. That's Mecca. So we take up the story there with what happened to Hagar and Ismail, and so what happened when she was left in the desert, how she cried out for help, how she, an angel came and showed her a fountain, which is, the well of Zamzam, which is still running in Mecca. So the Hajj ritual does recreate that sacred story. And the other thing I would say, important tradition, would be, I think, of the etiquette of hospitality. There's there's various different statements. The guest is the beloved of God, and you'll see people eyes light up, like, come to my house, you're honoring my house, and so that's a traditional practice, the emphasis on being a good neighbor and the emphasis of honoring your guest. Sacred stories we'll find in the Hajj ritual, we'll find even in the Salat, there's a sacred story about that. So there's many sacred stories that we remember when we do the practices. The only thing is that we're supposed to use that history for a connection in the present, and not simply a memorial reminder, but it's something that helps us connect to God and connect to our society in the here and now.
Yes, thank you. So what would be your take-home message today? If we could retain one thing from our discussion today, what would it be?
I think that that to understand that Islam is not a monolith, that it has a lot of variety, and that there's a continuum of different ways in which people will practice. I think also I'm not going to say that every negative thing that you see is they're not Muslims, it's fake. Like, we have within the community, there may be people who practice and observe in ways that are quite different than I would, or I would find my neighbors or my community. So we want to see beyond stereotypes, and to understand that it is a broad and diverse religion. And I converted to Islam I was going to be an Anglican minister. That didn't quite work out the way I had expected it to, but I was looking for something that was life-giving and uplifting, and I found it through my interest in Christian spirituality and even contemplative and monastic disciplines. I found something inspiring and life-giving. So we're much more than stereotypes. There's a rich tradition that's life-giving. I'll leave you with one. I don't know if this is a takeaway or an interesting fact, that in the Guinness Book of World Records, the longest continuing running university was founded by a Muslim woman, and that's the Qawariyun University in Fez. So there's a lot more under the surface than people will normally consider, and it's worth being open and understanding to see what you might find there.
That's a wonderful fact to share. Thank you for that. Where can we learn more if we'd like to learn more about Islam?
So one of the things I do as a reservist, I'm allowed to continue in various different organizations. So I'm an executive director for a society called the Algebra Society, which has got some very good educational tools. And also someone from the Algebra Society who is also part of my endorsing community as a chaplain, is writing a biography. It's called Muhammad the World Changer. It's being put out by St. Martin's Press. This is coming out in October. It's really, I think, the best biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And I had about a year and a half to help kind of walk through this text with the author, who's a colleague. And so I think these are some very good sources. It's difficult to find. I don't think you have any translation of the Quran because it's such a nuanced text. You get many different interpretations, and so sometimes what you see is the perception of the interpreters as opposed to the power of the language itself. So those would be the sources that I would be, I trust and that I'm involved in terms of helping to prepare in the here and now, in a language that speaks to a Western audience.
Yes, what a very noteworthy book to share. Thank you. I'd like to say thank you on behalf of all of our families for the interview today, Padre Helms. This was absolutely interesting, and I know I certainly learned something worthwhile as well. So thank you for your time, and until next time.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all in Europe and with military families everywhere. Thank you for the work that you do. We couldn't do it without you.